This time next week, you could be leader of the opposition. So I'm keen to, I guess, find out a bit more about you as a politician, your kind of vision for the country, not so much getting kind of dragged into the weeds of the Tory leadership race that has been going on, it feels, like for some time.
Okay.
The first question I'm going to ask might seem a bit strange, but I'm not always completely clear. Do you want to be Prime Minister?
So what I want to do is make the country more conservative. And by that I mean, policies that will help deliver better growth, just a better life for everyone. And I think having a conservative government is the best way to do that. And I think that right now I have the best agenda to lead my party and to get us there.
But do you want to be Prime Minister? I mean, honestly, if you ask most MPs, they would all be like, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Do you want to be Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think it's about wanting to be Prime Minister. I think it's not an award. It's not like winning a competition. It's actually a very serious job that requires a lot of sacrifice. It changes your life forever. You can't just go back and work in a normal job afterwards. It changes the life of your family. So I'm very, very wary of saying, oh, I want to be Prime Minister, I want to be in charge. I think that people need to understand what is the service that you're providing, rather than how can we help you fulfill a personal ambition. For me, the ambition is about the country, not myself.
Are you worried about some of those potential sacrifices, though?
Well, I've thought about them very carefully, and also with my family as well. So I am very well aware of how life could change for the worse in many circumstances. But I also worry even more about the direction of the country and what will happen unless we can turn things around.
So you think your personal life could change for the worse then if you are Prime Minister?
I think that if you look at the previous Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, whoever, there's actually quite a lot of animosity towards politicians and prime ministers. People blame them for things that have gone wrong, even when it's not necessarily anything to do with them. And I think that you harbour that, you have to carry the weight of things happening on your watch. It's a lot of responsibility. And I think people should not go into it thinking it's going to be a lark or a game. It's a very serious thing. But right now, what I'm campaigning for is to be leader of my party and be leader of the opposition. That is what the public has said Conservatives should do right now.
Let's talk about, you talked there about how you want to change the country, make it more conservative. So I just want to kind of talk about some of the kind of big issues facing the country. We've, of course, got the budget coming up this week. Do you think we spend too much on public services?
I think that we are not earning enough for the public services that the country wants. And we need to figure out a way to get the economy growing again. How much should we spend on public services is how long is a piece of string. You need to ask, what is it that you want to deliver? And are you earning enough or producing enough wealth in order to deliver that? Right now, we're paying more on debt interest than we're spending on defence. We're not earning enough in order to cover our costs, and we need to rewire the state and the system in order to deliver what people want.
And that sort of kind of long-term sort of ambition, and I know you'll talk a lot about a kind of long-term vision, if you like, but the kind of immediate crisis then, if you're talking there about the levels of debt, is there a particular budget that you think you could make savings there? Where would you cut?
Well, this is one of the things that I've been very, very careful to emphasise in this contest. We've just had 14 years in government. So you've seen the decisions that I have taken, either myself as business secretary or collective responsibility as a party. The public has just voted us out. So we need to go back to first principles and work out what things should look like. I will not be the person responding to the budget, but I think we can start from certain principles that we don't want the cost of living to keep increasing. We don't want people to have too much of a burden to the extent that they don't even start businesses or they give up. And that's where I think an opposition party needs to start. And then it can create an effective critique where it thinks the government is going wrong. I will be supportive where it thinks the government is going right.
I know you're not trying to be nailed down on specific policies, but to try and grapple with who you are, what your kind of broad principles are. Let's take the NHS, for example. There is the government says they want a national conversation about the future of the NHS. Do you think that the funding model of the NHS should be part of that conversation?
Well, yet again, this is another thing where we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by the funding model? I know what we spent on the NHS. We spent more than ever before. We put a message on the side of a bus that we'd spend £350 million a week more. We spent almost twice more than that, and still it isn't working. So I don't think the issue is funding. The NHS is an institution that was built for a young, relatively young, homogenous working population. We are now a complex, diverse, aging population. How does that model evolve? What kind of reforms do we need in order to deliver for the society we have today and what we have tomorrow? That's what I want us to work on. Talking about the funding, in my view, is how we end up in the wrong place. It's like, well, we should spend this amount, we should spend that amount. What are we spending it on? How do we need to deliver better? And those are not questions which I've worked out on the back of an envelope since July. We're going to need the whole party to figure this out.
But the funding does matter. You there touched on something, that we've got an ageing population with complex needs. There's some people who think, look, if the NHS is going to survive, we need to look at a national insurance model. Should that be on the table for discussion?
Well, I think everything should be always on the table for discussion. What shouldn't happen is that you get into government and you don't know what you want to do yet, which is where Labour are. They had 14 years in opposition. What have they been doing with that time? What I'm saying is that we've tried our way, it didn't work, we're going to go and work out something different. What I'm not going to say is, well, I've worked out all these ideas, vote for them.
But say a national insurance model should be on the table for the NHS, that's fair?
I'm not going down any specific policy area, because that will then be a speculative conversation.
But these are big, important, big picture questions, right?
They are, but what I find very frustrating is that I'm asked speculative questions where I give a speculative thought, and that is then presented as a firm point of view. And I don't want to have that kind of conversation. I want us to have a serious conversation about what is it that we're trying to deliver, what makes sense for the society that we have today.
You're talking about, looking at what the NHS is spending money on. And one of the things that the NHS is spending increasing amounts of money on is mental health. And I was quite struck by a pamphlet that you put your name to, Conservatism in Crisis. You obviously know what I'm talking about. But in the pamphlet it says, the socialisation of mental health, whereby mental health moved from something that people worked on for their own benefit to something where everyone had to treat people differently, has both created costs and failed to improve people's mental health outcomes. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, what that statement is saying, and what I do agree with, is that the way we deal with mental health has changed, but it is not improving, it is getting worse. And we need to find out why that is happening. Why is it that we have, in some people's words, a mental health crisis, despite us doing quite a lot in that space? And we don't know the answer. The demand for mental health services is increasing. It's having an impact on the workplace. A lot of people who are signed off work aren't signed off because of physical disability, but because of very poor mental health. And that's something that I want us to work on.
So do you think what we're kind of like medicalising or putting a label on something that is, for some people, normal life?
Well, what I am saying is that we've changed the way that we approach things. Is it better? Is it worse? Let's look at that. There will be individual cases which I can, speak of in my constituency where I can say, well, that's definitely gone wrong. But what's happening all across the country? Let's look at that.
I mean, I guess, some people will be saying we need to be resourcing mental health better. 1.2 million people waiting for mental health treatment on the NHS. Suicide, the biggest killer for men under 50. And then we worry, reading statements like that you're not taking it seriously.
Well, I think that this is one of the challenges that we have to grapple with in this age, that if every time an observation is made, the runaway conclusion is that they've made this observation, so they must want to do the worst possible thing for me. That is not a way to have a conversation about how to fix things. If you want to fix things, you have to observe what is happening and say, well, this isn't going well, and it's changed from how we used to do it. How can we make it better? But if the only conversation that is allowed to be had is more money, how can we spend more money on it, that it doesn't fix anything, especially at a time when the country is not producing more. It's not, it's not increasing growth at the level that we would like to have, as other European countries and even countries like Japan and Mexico and the US are finding.
I guess I'm asking these questions because I feel like you're a politician who talks a lot about personal responsibility.
That's right.
Do you feel like the state is, I guess, infantilising people sometimes?
I think that the state does infantilise a lot of things. Do we really need to ban smoking in pub gardens? Do we really need a football regulator? These things are micro on their own, but the cumulative impact of everything that the state is doing, I think, is too much. A lot of these things are not public services. A football regulator is not public services. More quangos are not necessarily more public services. I think I saw something about an office for value for money that Rachel Reeves may or may not be proposing. We keep creating more bureaucracy, more regulation, and yet the public services are not improving. And I think that's one of the things that we as a party got wrong. We, the Conservatives, followed this model. This is what I call the Blairite sort of third way model. And maybe it worked in 1997, but it does not work now.
In the same pamphlet on mental health, you, or I'm not sure if it was you who wrote it, but it says this.
It wasn't me, but I did read it.
On autism. Because you say that the approach, or the pamphlet says the approach to autism now offers economic advantages and protections. If you have a neurodiversity diagnosis, e.g. anxiety, autism, you're in a category similar to race or biological sex in terms of discrimination, law and general attitudes. As a child, you may well get better treatment or equipment at school. I guess a lot of parents reading that might be quite offended, because they might feel that it's very different from their experience with autistic children at school who are not getting the support that they need, and feel that, it's not that they're asking for better treatment, but they do need schools or whatever it is to adapt to their children.
Yes, and I think that it would be completely wrong to read that and assume that that means that we don't want to provide any help for those with special educational needs. I see it not just in my constituency, but in my family. Something is happening. If I look at the levels of developmental disabilities in my own family, it is increasing from generation to generation. What I'm talking about is that there is a lot of demand on public services. What can we do to help manage that at the same time as providing more in terms of funding? But if I talk about my local councils, in fact, councils all across the country, as I saw as local government minister, they are all telling me that they're spending more and more and they can't keep up. What can we do to help those parents? But, there's a pamphlet that someone has written, and, there are people who do have autism who have contributed to that pamphlet. Not everything is going to be stuff that people can agree with, but let's have a conversation about how we help those families. I know how hard it is. How do we help them? What is causing this? How can we reduce the demand for, mental health services, get people more resilient? How can we help those who have autism? If we fix mental health, there's more money around for developmental disabilities. How can we look at a systemic approach? How local government funding works, adult social care, children's social care, how that links with the NHS, it's all linked. And I don't want us to look at these issues in isolation. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at the system, not just problem by problem, because that way doesn't work.
I said that I do want to get dragged into the Conservative leadership race, but I do feel like I have to talk about the spat that's kind of erupted, if you like, with yourself and Robert Jenrick over the last couple of days. You wrote an article this weekend implying that he doesn't have integrity because he was sacked and there was perhaps a whiff of impropriety. I mean, I guess, he might say, I haven't hacked into anyone's website.
Well, he might say that, but what I think is that in a leadership contest, people are going to present the very best offer that they have. And what I'm saying is that I'm somebody who has integrity, and I am somebody who a lot of people have said...
I guess my point there is,
if I may just finish, a lot of people have said, we're voting for you because we're quite worried about what we saw with the party. People did tell me, whether it was COVID contracts, something I think is unfair, inferring that there was a whiff of impropriety with that, having to explain all these things, constantly explaining. Just having somebody who doesn't have that baggage is something that I offer.
I guess my point is that, supporters of Robert Jenrick might be saying, you're talking about integrity and baggage, but you were the one who in 2008 hacked into Harriet Harman's website.
Well,
that was illegal, wasn't it?
Well,
had
let's
a
talk about...
prison sentence of 5 years at the time.
Let's talk about that. No, it didn't. It was a summary offence at the time, the same as a speeding ticket. It was actually something quite different from what the law is now. But also, that in itself is an example of how I have integrity. No one knew about that, Sophie. I came out and said this. It was 10
you said
years...
it as a joke.
Yes, well, but I said it 10 years before I was this was something that happened 10 years before I was a Member of Parliament. It wasn't something that I did in Parliament. And I came out and said, actually, do you know what? I did this thing. And I never realised just how much hassle MPs got. Harriet Harman and I had a joke about it, and what did I do? I put a picture of Boris Johnson's, campaign photo on it. And I didn't actually, I'm glad that you asked this, I didn't actually hack into it. I typed to go into the website, and it asked for a password, and literally the first thing I put me in the back end. What it shows is that at that time, and maybe even now, I do like playing pranks, I have humour. But I told people that. Being honest is something that people say they want in their politicians, but when a politician is being honest, then we can't just say, oh, well, that shows that you don't have integrity. I'm very pleased, actually, to have the opportunity to say that, yes, I put a photo of Boris Johnson on Harriet Harman's website because I thought it was very funny. 10 years later, when I got to Parliament, Harriet and I laughed about it. It was a summary offence, a speeding ticket, and that was that. That is not an integrity issue. Being honest is, and I'm honest.
Do you still think it was quite funny then?
It was very amusing at the time. Now that I'm an MP, it's a lot less amusing because now you see it from the other side. And that's one of the things that I was saying, that we attack MPs all the time and everybody thinks that, the email they send to an MP or the tweet they send to an MP, it's just them, blowing off steam. But as a Member of Parliament, we are recipients of a whole load of stuff and people don't necessarily understand what we're dealing with. So yes, 20 years ago, I did that, I was in my 20s, but actually, we evolve as people, we learn things. And talking about my experiences is a good thing, it's honesty, and we should have more of that.
There's one other thing that I want to ask you before we go. In the leadership race, people describe you as someone who would cross the road to have a fight, someone who's abrasive, someone who is aggressive even. And it does strike me that, this is some of the language that we often use about black women. Do you recognise that?
Well, I don't know why people say these things. I'm sure that there will be some people who want to play to stereotypes. One of the other ones that I get is, she's very lazy. So both aggressive and lazy at the same time, despite all of the jobs I do at the same time, looking serene, might I add, while I do them. I think that people will often just look for whatever they can to drag you down.
Do you think there is some racism in that, though?
Well, I don't know who's saying it. And I try not to get bogged down with what people, with what people are saying behind my back. What I do know is that I am somebody who's very blunt. That is true. I am very forthright. And I'm very confident as well. I'm not a wallflower. And people will often take your strengths and present them as weaknesses. So I think that's what's happening. I don't like throwing accusations of racism and misogyny unless I know who is actually saying these things and being very clear about what their motivations might be. But I also want to think the very best of everybody. And I think sometimes going through every possible explanation why someone might be doing something before we get to the racism and before we get to the sexism is actually a healthy way to have a debate and to respond to criticism.
If you win on Saturday, will you give Robert Jenrick a job in your shadow cabinet?
I think that all of the 6 candidates should have a job in the shadow cabinet. Whether they want to do what I think they should do is a totally different matter. But the Conservative team is more than the shadow cabinet. We spend a lot of time obsessing about who's in the shadow cabinet. I'm going to need all of the 120 MPs.
What would you give Robert Jenrick then? It doesn't sound like you're going to give him a...
I am not having any conversations about what may or may not happen until we know the results on Saturday. I don't think that's right. I haven't won anything yet. It's neck and neck. Anything could happen. And measuring the curtains and deciding what job I'm going to give other people is not me. Other candidates may be promising jobs and saying they will appoint this person or that person. I have not done that. I have not offered any job to anybody.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.